Could a harmless 60s TV movie really frighten viewers more than the horror films playing in theaters? Late at night, when families thought television was safe, strange ghost stories, cursed mirrors, haunted houses, and forbidden broadcasts slipped into living rooms like something that should never have aired. These were not just old programs, they were small-screen nightmares. And one of them became so unsettling, people still argue about what viewers actually saw. Number 15. The Open Door, 1966. The scariest sound on television was not a scream, but a voice no one could explain. The open door turns a simple homecoming into a slow-burning ghost trap. As Colonel Mortimer returns from years in India and finds his young son wasting away in bed, terrified by a strange wailing outside the house. The setup feels almost too quiet at first, and that is exactly why it works. There are no grand monsters crashing through windows, no carnival shocks, no easy relief. Instead, the story uses the most ordinary fear of all. A parent hearing their child describe something invisible and realizing comfort may not be enough. As part of mystery and imagination, it carried that candlelit British television mood where every hallway looked older than memory and every sound felt like a warning. That restraint made it worse, because silence gave the viewer nowhere to hide. Late-night viewers were not just watching a ghost story, they were being asked to listen into the dark. And once that unseen voice entered the room, the question became unbearable. Who, or what, was calling from the other side of the door? Number 14. The Fall of the House of Usher, 1966. Some houses do not feel haunted, they feel guilty. The Fall of the House of Usher brought Edgar Allan Poe's decaying nightmare to television with the kind of gothic pressure that crawls rather than attacks. A young man arrives at an isolated mansion, searching for the woman he loves, only to discover that the Usher family is not merely strange, but trapped inside its own poisonous bloodline, pride, and fear. Roderick Usher becomes the heart of the disturbance, nervous, controlling, and convinced that the family curse is not a legend, but a sentence already being carried out. The most disturbing part is not just the old house, the illness, or the family secrets. It is the way the story makes imprisonment feel emotional before it becomes physical. Television made the rooms feel smaller, almost as if viewers were trapped inside too. For viewers watching in dark rooms, the mansion became a living coffin, filled with whispers, locked doors, and the sense that love itself could become a curse. By the final stretch, the question was not whether the house would fall, but how many souls it would pull down with it. Number 13. Frankenstein, 1968. The monster was not the only thing being stitched together in the dark. So was television's idea of serious horror. Frankenstein brought Mary Shelley's legendary nightmare into the intimate space of the living room, where the story felt less like a creature feature and more like a private confession gone wrong. Instead of relying only on thunder, castles, and laboratory spectacle, this version leaned into the terrible question at the center of the tale. What happens when human ambition refuses to stop at the edge of life itself? Victor Frankenstein becomes less a heroic genius than a man slowly consumed by his own experiment, while the creature stands as the living proof of a mistake too powerful to bury. That made the broadcast unusually unsettling for late-night viewers, because the fear did not come only from appearance, it came from responsibility. The rooms, the shadows, the silences, all seemed to ask whether the real horror was the created being or the creator who abandoned him. In an era when television often softened old horror stories for home audiences, this adaptation kept the moral sickness alive. It reminded viewers that some monsters are not born evil. Some are made, rejected, and left to wander through the ruins of someone else's pride. Number 12. Dracula, 1968. The Count did not need to burst through the screen. He only had to stand still and let the room grow colder. Dracula gave television viewers a restrained, eerie version of the vampire legend, one that felt more like a candlelit warning than a loud monster show. Denholm Elliott's unusual interpretation helped separate it from the familiar theatrical versions that audiences already knew. This Dracula was less about physical attack and more about atmosphere, suggestion, and the slow corruption of safety. The horror came from watching ordinary people realize that old legends were not dead stories, but living threats, moving quietly through bedrooms, corridors, and polite society. The small screen format made the tale feel strangely personal. Instead of a grand cinema castle towering over the audience, viewers were invited into a more enclosed nightmare, where every glance felt suspicious and every invitation carried danger. That was why it suited late-night television so well. It did not need the scale of a movie palace. It needed silence, darkness, and a viewer sitting too close to the screen. Beneath the gothic elegance, the story touched a deeper fear. That evil does not always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes, it arrives with manners, waits at the door, and only enters when someone lets it in. Number 11. Casting the Runes. 1968. A curse is always scarier when it arrives like paperwork. Casting the Runes turns supernatural horror into something cold, precise, and almost bureaucratic, following a victim marked by an occultist whose revenge feels terrifying because it has rules. Based on the ghostly imagination of M.R. James, this television adaptation avoids easy chaos and builds dread through inevitability. The horror is not simply that something evil exists. It is that once the curse is passed on, time begins moving against you. That idea is perfect for late-night viewing, because it creates the feeling of an invisible clock ticking inside the room. The main character is not chased by a monster in the usual sense. He is hunted by fate, by symbols, by knowledge he wishes he never received. Every conversation starts to feel dangerous. Every object could be evidence. Every shadow suggests that the unseen has already stepped closer. What makes the story especially gripping is its investigative tension. Viewers are pulled into the puzzle, but the more they understand, the more doomed the situation feels. It is horror as a trapdoor, fascinating until you realize you are standing on it. Long after the broadcast ended, the most disturbing question lingered in the dark. If a curse can be handed from one person to another, who would you trust not to pass it to you? Number 10. The Bells of Hell. 1968. A honeymoon should not sound like a funeral bell. The Bells of Hell takes one of horror's oldest tricks, a couple arriving somewhere they should never have entered, and turns it into a tight little late-night nightmare. The story follows newlyweds who find themselves inside an unnerving inn, the kind of place that feels deserted and watched at the same time. What makes it effective is the sense that the danger is not rushing toward them, but waiting patiently, as if the walls already know how the night will end. The inn becomes more than a location. It becomes a trap dressed in ordinary furniture, quiet service, and strange pauses. Viewers did not need elaborate effects to feel the pressure. The fear came from atmosphere, unfamiliar rooms, unsettling behavior, and the growing suspicion that the couple's fresh new life has accidentally stepped into someone else's old darkness. As part of the late-night horror tradition, it carried exactly the kind of mood that made viewers lower the volume but keep watching. The title itself suggests doom before the story even begins. Bells are supposed to mark weddings, warnings, or endings, and here they seem to do all three. By the time the unease tightens, the audience is left with a brutal late-night thought. Sometimes the worst place to spend your first night together is somewhere that has been waiting for you. Number 9. The Corpse Can't Play. 1968. Nothing ruins innocence faster than a child who knows too much. The Corpse Can't Play begins with a setting that should feel harmless, even cheerful, a children's party. But the story twists that comfort into something deeply wrong when a strange boy arrives and the games begin to feel less like play and more like a ritual. That is what gives this late-night horror entry its nasty little power. It takes one of the safest images in family life, children gathered together, and quietly poisons it. There is no need for grand gothic scenery when the ordinary world has already been turned against the viewer. The terror comes from behavior that feels almost normal until it suddenly does not. A look lasts too long. A game has the wrong energy. A child's presence becomes less cute than unnatural. For late-night audiences, this was exactly the kind of story that could crawl under the skin because it made the home feel unsafe. Television was usually the family appliance, the glowing box in the corner, but this story used that closeness against the viewer. It suggested that horror did not need a castle, a graveyard, or a storm. It could walk into a party, smile like a child, and change the rules before anyone understood the danger. That is why its title still lands with a cold little shock. The dead may not play, but something else certainly does. Number 8. The Kiss of Blood. 1968. Some titles sound like a warning label, and this one sounds like it should have been locked away. The Kiss of Blood closed out the late-night horror run, with a story remembered for its dark reputation, its unsettling emotional edge, and the kind of late-hour intensity that made viewers wonder how far television was willing to go. The power of the title alone is immediate. It suggests intimacy corrupted, romance turned poisonous, and revenge dressed in something almost seductive but dangerous. What made these broadcast horror pieces so effective was not only what they showed, but what they implied. Television audiences at the time were not watching with the distance of a cinema crowd. They were at home, often alone, with the feeling that something forbidden had slipped into the schedule after respectable programming had ended. The story's atmosphere carries that forbidden quality. It plays like a nightmare built from betrayal, obsession, and the fear that human emotions can become monstrous when pushed too far. In the dark, nostalgic world of 60s television horror, this was the kind of entry that did not need to be perfectly remembered by everyone to feel powerful. Its reputation does part of the haunting. The gaps, the rumors, the late-night placement, all add to the mystery. Some television horrors disturb because they are clear. Others disturb because they feel half-lost, half-whispered, and impossible to fully recover. Number 7. William and Mary, 1968. The most disturbing prison in horror is not a dungeon. It is a mind that cannot escape. William and Mary turns one of Roald Dahl's coldest ideas into a cruel little television nightmare, built around a scientist who discovers a way to preserve consciousness after physical life has ended. On paper, it sounds like a breakthrough. On screen, it becomes something far more frightening. A man reduced to awareness, memory, and helpless observation, while the woman he once controlled finally holds power over him. That is what makes this late-night horror entry so sharp. It does not rely on a monster at the window or a ghost in the hallway. Its terror is domestic, psychological, and almost wickedly ironic. The story asks a question viewers could not easily shake. Would eternal survival still feel like a miracle if you had no freedom left? For late-night audiences, this was not comfortable supernatural fun. It was the kind of horror that crawled through the imagination after the broadcast ended, because the fear was not impossible to understand. Everyone fears being trapped. Everyone fears losing control. And here, television turned that fear into a living experiment. The most chilling part is that the nightmare does not roar. It simply watches, understands everything, and can do almost nothing. Number 6. The Ghost of Sierra de Cobre, 1964. The dead do not need a body when they can use the telephone. The Ghost of Sierra de Cobre is one of the strongest true made-for-TV horror thrillers of the decade because it understands how to make modern objects feel haunted. Instead of relying only on old castles and candlelit corridors, it brings the supernatural into a world of phone lines, grief, investigation, and psychological uncertainty. The story follows a paranormal investigator drawn into the case of a wealthy family haunted by eerie calls that seem to come from beyond the grave. That premise was tailor-made for television, because the sound of a ringing phone in a quiet room is already unsettling. The viewer waits, the characters freeze, and suddenly an everyday object becomes a doorway to something impossible. The film mixes ghost story atmosphere with detective-style curiosity, giving the audience a mystery to follow, while the dread keeps tightening. What makes it disturbing is the emotional hook beneath the haunting. The fear is not just, is there a ghost? It is, what if the dead still have unfinished business? And what if they know how to reach us? Late-night viewers could turn off the television, but they could not turn off every sound in the house. A creak was just a creak until this story made it suspicious. A phone call was just a call until it started to feel like someone had dialed from the other side. Number 5. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1968. The monster does not break into the house when he is already wearing your face. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde gave television one of its darkest psychological nightmares, powered by Jack Palance's intense performance and Dan Curtis's taste for gothic tension. The classic story works because it is not merely about transformation, it is about permission. Dr. Jekyll wants to separate his respectable self from his hidden urges, but the experiment does not free him, it exposes him. That is what makes the tale so disturbing on television. The small screen brings the viewer closer to every twitch of control, every shift in posture, every moment where the civilized mask begins to crack. Instead of a distant Victorian horror, it becomes an intimate study of a man losing the argument with himself. The production's theatrical mood gives the story weight, but the real fear is moral. Hyde is not an outside invader. He is the truth Jekyll thought he could manage, contain, and summon whenever he wished. Late-night audiences watching this version were not just waiting for the next transformation, they were watching the collapse of self-control. That is why the story remains so gripping. It asks whether evil is something that attacks us from the dark, or something we hide inside ourselves until the right formula gives it permission to come out. Number 4. Daughter of the Mind, 1969. Grief can make even the smartest man believe in ghosts. Daughter of the Mind turns a haunting into something colder and more emotionally dangerous by placing it around a brilliant scientist who believes his dead daughter is trying to contact him. The idea is heartbreaking before it becomes frightening. A father hears, sees, or senses what should be impossible, and every rational defense begins to weaken because love wants the impossible to be true. That emotional hook gives the story its late-night power. It is not just about supernatural activity. It is about how easily sorrow can become a doorway. The film also carries the nervous atmosphere of the Cold War era, where science, espionage, psychology, and the unknown could all overlap in disturbing ways. Viewers are pulled between explanations. Is this a ghost story, a manipulation, a breakdown, or something even stranger? That uncertainty keeps the tension alive. The audience wants comfort for the grieving father, but comfort may be exactly the trap. Made-for-TV horror often worked best when it brought fear into familiar emotional spaces, and this one uses loss as its haunted room. It suggests that the dead do not need to appear with thunder and shadows. Sometimes they arrive through memory, through longing, through the one voice a person would risk everything to hear again. And once that voice calls, the most dangerous question is not whether it is real, but whether you would follow it anyway. Number 3. Fear No Evil. 1969. The mirror does not reflect the room. It remembers what should have stayed buried. Fear No Evil is one of the key late 60s made-for-TV occult chillers, the kind of film that helped prove horror could thrive on network television without losing its bite. Its central image is beautifully simple and deeply unnerving, an antique mirror connected to possession, obsession, and a presence that refuses to remain dead. Mirrors are perfect horror objects because they already make people uneasy. They show the self, but slightly removed, slightly silent, slightly too still. What makes it effective is the combination of professional rationality and old-world occult dread. The main character approaches the situation with intelligence, but intelligence does not stop the atmosphere from thickening. Every reflection becomes suspicious. Every room with glass feels watched. For late-night viewers, that was a cruel trick, because after the broadcast ended, they still had mirrors in their own homes. The film's horror is not loud. It is patient. It understands that a supernatural object becomes frightening when it feels ordinary enough to belong to anyone. By the end, the mirror is no longer decoration. It is evidence, doorway, and warning. Some things do not haunt houses. They wait in surfaces, staring back. Number 2. Whistle, and I'll Come to You. 1968. The beach was empty, but the sound answered anyway. Whistle and I'll Come to You is one of the most chilling television ghost stories ever made because it proves how little horror needs when atmosphere is strong enough. A professor finds an old whistle on a lonely coast, and what begins as curiosity slowly turns into the feeling that something has noticed him. There is no need for constant explanation, no parade of shocks, no overstuffed mythology. The terror comes from isolation, wind, distance, and the awful suggestion that the unseen is moving closer. The story's genius lies in its restraint. A hotel room becomes frightening. A bedsheet becomes unforgettable. A stretch of beach becomes a place where the rational mind starts to feel very small. The main character's intellectual confidence makes the haunting even sharper, because he begins as a man who thinks he can explain the world and ends up confronted by something that does not care about explanation. Late-night viewers felt the power of that simplicity. The broadcast did not merely show a ghost, it created the sensation of being alone with one. The title itself feels like a dare, and that is the cruelest part. The professor does not go looking for evil in a dramatic way. He simply blows a whistle. After that, the darkness does what darkness does best. It answers, but not in any language that brings comfort. Number 1. Night Gallery, 1969. Before the 70s turned television horror into an obsession, one strange gallery opened its doors and changed the mood of the room. Night Gallery began as a made-for-TV anthology pilot from Rod Serling, and it arrived with a brilliant hook. Each story was introduced through a painting, as if the viewer were being invited to stare at a nightmare already captured on canvas. That framing device made the broadcast feel elegant, cursed, and dangerous. It was not just a collection of stories, it was a museum of dread. The pilot's most famous segment, Eyes, gained extra legend because it was directed by a young Steven Spielberg. But the entire production carried the feeling of television discovering a darker identity after midnight. Serling understood something crucial about home viewers. They did not only want monsters, they wanted moral traps, cruel twists, and supernatural punishments that felt deserved and shocking at the same time. Night Gallery delivered that with style. The paintings gave each tale a ritual quality, like viewers were crossing into a forbidden room one frame at a time. For late-night audiences, this was not safe family television. It was polished, eerie, and strangely adult in its sense of consequence. That is why it deserves the top spot. It did not simply disturb viewers with one story. It suggested that television itself could become a haunted gallery, and every picture on the wall had been waiting for someone to look too closely. So the next time someone says old television horror was harmless, remember these 15 nightmares that slipped quietly into living rooms after dark. They did not need modern effects to disturb viewers. They used shadows, silence, grief, and suggestion. Which one would have scared you the most? Comment your pick and subscribe for more forgotten screen nightmares.